Ocean Dread. The series comprises 7 nightmarish narratives set at sea, carefully selected from the ever-yellowing pages of Weird Tales magazine. The Horror in the Hold by Frank Belknap Long. The scourge of the Caribbees accepted his ill luck with grim fortitude. The roar of the surf was loud in his ears as he dozed in his cabin, and, for a time at least, his ships were safe. Hogs, hens' eggs, fish, cocoas, and aqua vitae, he enumerated between his teeth. Howbeit our sails are badly bruised, we have victuals aplenty. 'Tis well we came upon such a pleasant isle. The Princess of Lubeck rose on a tremulous swell, and the scourge slept. But Pedro de Castro spoke to him in a sibilant whisper, albeit a stout deck and the length of the princess separated the twain. "Bartholomew Mabbott," he murmured, "there is nothing between you and the frying-pan but a little powder. Heretic infidel, you will steam and sizzle in the devil's furnace." The jeweled and painted head of the Spaniard swayed for a moment above the enormous quadrant by which the ship was steered, and a lean, sun-browned arm waved in defiance. Then he lowered himself to the deck and crawled softly forward on his hands and knees. He crawled beneath the topmast and crouched in the shadows, while the wind whistled eerily through the twisted rigging above his head. He waited for a luminous strip of moonlight to cross the lower section of the stern castle. He waited patiently, for the night was young, and time did not concern him. At length, the cabin door stood out clear and sharp in the moonlight, and in a moment he was through it and descending a flight of crooked stairs in his naked feet. He was a cumbersome figure of a man to look at, 6'3" in height and broad of shoulder, yet he moved with the agility of a small lad. His swarthy face looked as if tropic suns had shone on it for centuries. His small eyes, beneath enormous eyebrows, suggested a savage and violent nature. He wore gold earrings and frayed breeches from which water dripped in a continuous stream. Wet clusters of thick black hair glittered weirdly on his nude torso. Halfway in his descent, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. The silence had become almost too oppressive, but it gave him a curious pleasure to discover that no lurking shadows had blotted out the stars, which were still plainly visible from where he stood. He chuckled and advanced less cautiously. Soon he was far down within the dim, shadowy hold, descending no longer by stairs, but by rope ladders that swayed disastrously with every lurch of the ship. As he clung to the heavy cords, the veins on his forehead swelled, and fierce exultation shone in his small, evil eyes. "A little powder will put Bartholomew into the frying-pan," he mumbled maliciously. A moment later he came to the end of the last ladder and hazarded a drop of 5 yards. He alighted upon his feet and found himself standing ankle-deep in a pool of greasy, ill-smelling bilge water. "Curse these English ships," he muttered angrily. "They're not made for gentlemen." "Not made for Spanish dogs," said a voice at his elbow. He gasped and wheeled abruptly. Facing him in the sickly yellow light stood the dim form of a huge Englishman. As he stared in amazement, his anger melted away, and beads of sweat came out on his dark forehead. "Madre de Dios," he blurted out. "'Tis the devil in person." "Mayhap," said the Englishman after a pause, "but he is a loyal devil who serves the Queen. If you advance another step, he will rive you in twain. Faith, it would be an act of charity to kill you." Pedro lowered his eyes and studied the blade which rested above his heart. It was a sharp blade, and the hand which held it did not tremble. "A brave fellow," thought Pedro, "but easily duped. Perhaps if I can addle his wits, he will sizzle with Bartholomew." A look of savage cunning came into the Spaniard's eyes. He swallowed hard, and when he spoke again his voice was steady. "Will you fight me?" he asked. A heavy silence fell, during which Pedro waited with a chilling spine for his enemy's reply. For moments that seemed interminable, the latter stood stiff and alert, and it was obvious that he was torn by conflicting emotions. The air was choked with whirling dust, and far back in the hold a small candle guttered and flared. At last, the Englishman spoke. "No, I will not fight you. You are a vile spy, and Master Mabbott will cut off your ears." Pedro made a furious grimace. "Have it your own way," he snarled, "but I would have killed you." Almost immediately, he regretted his bravado. A fearful burning in his shoulder warned him that his tall adversary was not to be trifled with. He raised his hand to the wound and groaned. The Englishman's mocking laugh smote painfully on his ears. "The dog isn't as brave as I thought he was. 'Tis excessively foolish to whimper so over a little wound." The taunt so infuriated Pedro that he threw caution to the winds. In the twinkling of an eye, he ducked and butted his enemy squarely in the stomach with his head. It was a ludicrous, almost childish trick, but it took the latter by surprise. He fell back and had barely time to recover his balance when Pedro rushed violently upon him. The two giants grappled and fell forward upon the wet planks. Pedro pummeled his enemy's face until his wrists ached and his knuckles were bruised and bleeding. Then he reached for his knife. The Englishman raised himself slightly, his fingers clutching at lacerated flesh. But Pedro's hand was nimble as a mouse to clutch the knife which rested beneath his breeches. In a moment he had it out, and was using it with terrible effect. The struggle lasted scarcely a minute. Pedro's arm rose and fell, and he breathed hard. At the last, the Englishman raised a horrible yell, and his head fell forward. For several minutes, Pedro crouched in silence above the dead man, and then, with an oath, he stood up. He stood up and wiped his dripping weapon on the seat of his breeches. The blade glittered evilly in the yellow light. "The poor fool has preceded Bartholomew into the frying pan." He chuckled. "'Tis perhaps well that the good captain should have a comrade to listen to his groans." Pedro took his enemy's body upon his shoulder and carried it into the oblong shadows cast by huge barrels as heavy as stone. He threw it down with a grunt of execration. He lifted pious eyes to the slanting black boards above him. "May all heretics perish," he cried, and shook his fist in a mighty fury. "May Bartholomew Mabbott's life be cut short. May his body burn." He sacrificed caution to anger and raised his voice in terrible imprecations. Finally, however, his anger subsided, and there began for him a hectic search. He clambered hysterically over barrels and, prying off lids, poked with his fingers into their smelly contents, led on by a curious sense of anticipation. The wound in his shoulder bled profusely, and sweat streamed from his forehead, but he did not cease his efforts until his hand had sunk into something soft that ran like grains of sand through his fingers when he lifted them. Then he fell a-blubbering and cried out that Bartholomew Mabbott would assuredly fry. He had discovered it at last, the El Dorado of his vengeance, a cask full of fine, white powder. He withdrew several paces and prepared his fuse. He worked now with all possible speed. He would make the fuse very long, since he did not want the explosion to occur until he had put a considerable distance between himself and the ship. An ugly thought crossed his mind. What if they caught him as he was about to slip into the water? Caramba! But it is not pleasant to be discovered in such enterprises. He could hear footsteps passing rapidly back and forth above his head. What if they were, even now, waiting on deck to surprise him? He must make the fuse so long that he would have time to explain what he had done and save the ship in the event of his capture. They would hang him, of course, but thoughts failed him when he tried to visualize the lively horror of what would happen if the cask should explode before he could escape or confess. He passed a lean hand over his forehead and coughed uneasily. Only a madman, he reflected, would expose himself to such dangers for the sake of destroying a few English murderers. But never mind, he would go through with it, and perhaps in Spain the king would speak high words to him and pinch his ear. Men had been made grandees for less. It was surely a splendid service to destroy such scoundrels and heretics as Bartholomew Mabbott and his thrice-accursed crew. Yes, he would certainly receive his reward. It was unfortunate that all the world could not be witnesses of his valor. He had the fuse in place, and was bending to light it, when he heard steps on the wet planks. He was too astonished at first to move, but when the steps drew very near, he raced forward, secured the slain man's sword, and crawled into a crevice between two barrels. By dint of repeating to himself that he could never be captured, he silenced the clamorous beating of his heart. As he crouched in the blackness, his face had an evil look. For a moment there was silence, and then drunken voices were raised in revelment. "The Dragon of England is lord of the main. 'Tis hard on the cowardly pirates of Spain." "Fools," Pedro whispered fiercely. "Since the defeat of the great Sidonia they have grown big with pride. If they but knew how near they are to the frying pan." A shadow fell athwart the barrels between which Pedro crouched. Presently, 3 men stood on the slippery planks and laughed crazily. They held goblets in their hands, and their lean, scarred faces were flushed with wine. It was obvious that they did not suspect Pedro's presence. The wrinkles about the Spaniard's eyes grew in volume. He laughed silently to himself. "Drunken pigs," he thought. "I shall splice them upon a sword if they make trouble." His brain throbbed with intensity of hate. He was in the temper to destroy anyone who might discover him. The wound in his shoulder burned fearfully, but he ignored the pain. For a long minute, the men laughed and cursed and slapped one another upon the back. Apparently they feared nothing, but Pedro smiled as he thought of the grains of powder in the cask that would put the scourge of the Caribbees into the frying pan. He was an astounding man, this Pedro. He crouched in the long shadows and smiled as the men before him cursed the ships of Spain and praised the Dragon of England. "'Tis the dragon will defend us," they said, and their teeth knocked together with excitement. "Never yet has the dragon forsaken his own. For 1,000 years he will rule the sea." Presently, for they had drunk heavily, they tottered so that they could scarcely stand, and searched about for a place to repose their unsteady bodies. Then it was that Pedro tightened his grip upon the Englishman's sword and crept cautiously forward. As he left the shadows, he became aware that the leanest of his enemies had collapsed against a barrel and lay tittering idiotically. But one remained standing directly before the barrels, making childish play in the air with his sword. And when he sighted Pedro, he gave a cry of amazement and anger, and flung himself forward. Pedro stepped warily aside and laughed outright. The big man snorted with rage, and, throwing caution to the winds, came at Pedro like a charging bull. Again, Pedro sidestepped. Too late the Englishman endeavored to arrest himself in his headlong flight. Before he could recover his balance, the point of his sword was buried in a stout wooden cask, and the Spaniard was at his back. As Pedro hacked at the bewildered man, he marveled that English dogs were so easily vanquished. Twice he ran his enemy through the body, and when the latter fell upon his face with a horrible moan and lay still, exultation grew rapidly upon him. As he sprang at the second Englishman, a tremor of hate went through his body. "I shall kill you!" he shouted, and delivered a lunge with lightning speed. The giant before him seemed suddenly to awaken from a dream. He flung his arm out to defend himself, and Pedro's blade, flashing in an arch, cut off one of his fingers. The Englishman gave vent to a dreadful shriek and drew his sword. Pedro's heart leaped with joy as he gazed into the eyes of fury before him. But he did not let an anticipation of victory affect his swordplay. He saw at once that this second man was a more formidable adversary, and accordingly he fenced with all his skill. There was the harsh ring of clashing blades as the 2 men circled about between the barrels. Hilt to hilt they fought and parried, and their eyes emitted little sparks as they advanced and retreated. For several moments the tall man held his own, meeting Pedro's thrusts with adequate parries and occasionally a stiff counterthrust, and then he began to give ground. Slowly he fell back under the ferocity of Pedro's attack. The Spaniard was quick to follow up his advantage, and in a moment he had the Englishman completely at his mercy. "Prepare to die," he shouted, and cut viciously beneath his opponent's guard. The tall seaman dropped his sword and groaned. Then, falling upon his knees, he begged for mercy. He was a pitiful spectacle as he cringed and cowered in the ill-lighted hold, but Pedro's heart held no charity. With a sudden wide movement of his arm, he sent the other sprawling, and a torrent of vile abuse poured from his lips. Then he struck, laying his enemy stark dead at his feet with the blood pouring from a great gash in his forehead. Pedro laughed uproariously and stepped deftly aside. As he approached his last victim, his eyes strayed over the man's swollen and bloated face, closed eyes and open mouth, from which issued the sounds of labored breathing. "I shall deepen his slumber," he murmured. Still laughing, he raised his sword and rained cuts upon the sleeper's head and shoulders. The limp form sprang into life with heart-breaking shrieks, and what followed was the foulest butchery. At last, Pedro's arm grew tired, and a sudden weariness beset him. The wound in his shoulder pained prodigiously. He sat down on the nearest barrel and wiped the beads of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. For a moment he sat and panted in the semi-darkness, while his eyes surveyed the horror he had wrought. Pedro was fastidious in all things, and the sight of his victims appalled him. The shadows about him seemed to deepen. He shivered and regarded the fuse, which was clearly visible from where he sat. His eyes regarded it with fearful contemplation. He had only to ignite the end of it, and the scourge would go into the frying pan. He rose unsteadily to his feet and staggered forward. The wound in his shoulder caused him exquisite torture. He picked the end of the fuse up and held it for a moment, clutched tightly in his sweaty palm. Then he struck his flint. Suddenly, something moved in the gloom behind him. He strove to ignite the end of the fuse, but his fingers trembled so violently that he could not control them. While he remained thus, shivering with fright, two eyes rose above the barrel on his left and regarded him steadily. It was unfortunate, perhaps, that Pedro should have turned his head at that moment, for pain and fear had robbed him of all caution. When he saw the eyes, he shrieked and shrieked again, and then delirium fastened on his tired brain. Clutching his left shoulder, he crawled hysterically forward on his knees, hurling curses at the thing that crouched in the gloom above him. For a moment the eyes disappeared, and then a long, scaly body came into view, supported by webbed limbs that raced forward with incredible rapidity. "The Dragon of England!" yelled Pedro. "Heaven pity my poor soul!" Great jaws yapped wide, revealing a row of conical teeth, and a piercing scream came from the shadows as they fastened voraciously upon soft, human flesh. There followed a moment of silence, and then, from somewhere in the darkness behind huge barrels, there arose the unmistakable sound of bones cracking beneath a horrible pressure. The scourge of the Caribbees awoke from a dream of a pleasant isle and sat up. A tall negro stood before him, quaking in every limb. "Master," he groaned, "4 of our men have been foully murdered." Bartholomew swallowed hard and rubbed his eyes. "Murdered?" he gasped. Who? The tall negro shuffled his feet. "We couldn't find the body, master. There were only a few odds and ends left, but we saved 2 earrings and some hair, and it looks as if he was a Spaniard." "But who killed him?" asked Bartholomew, and shivered slightly. "The queer-looking monster we caught on the beach this morning," replied the negro. "The big scaly monster that you were bringing back to show Her Majesty. You forgot to feed him, and mayhap he was hungry. I don't think he likes Spaniards." The scourge scratched his ear, and a grin of satisfaction spread athwart his massive face. "See if there's a Spanish ship in the bay," he thundered. "We'll give them a dose of salt to season their vileness. And as for that monster, treat him with respect. Deny him nothing, and if he is hungry, we have victuals aplenty. Hogs, hens' eggs, fish, cocoas, and aquavitae. Depend upon it, we shall not permit him to starve." The negro laughed and disappeared through the cabin door. Bartholomew Mabbott dressed reflectively. "There was enough powder in the hold to blow us to atoms," he murmured. 'Tis as if St. George had protected us. Far down within the ship, a fat crocodile blinked contentedly and dozed over his victuals. Sea Curse by Robert E. Howard. And some return by the failing light, and some in the waking dream, for she hears the heels of the dripping ghosts that ride the rough roof beam. Kipling. They were the brawlers and braggarts, the loud boasters and hard drinkers of Faring Town, John Kulrek and his crony, Lie-lip Canool. Many a time have I, a tousled-haired lad, stolen to the tavern door to listen to their curses, their profane arguments and wild sea-songs, half fearful and half in admiration of these wild rovers. Aye, all the people of Faring Town gazed on them with fear and admiration, for they were not like the rest of the faring men. They were not content to ply their trade along the coasts and among the shark-teeth shoals. No yawls, no skiffs for them. They fared farther than any other man in the village, for they shipped on the great sailing ships that went out on the white tides to brave the restless grey ocean and make ports in strange lands. Ah, I mind it was swift times in the little sea-coast village of Faring when John Kulrek came home with his furtive Lie-lip at his side, swaggering down the gangplank in his tarry sea-clothes and the broad leather belt that held his ever-ready dagger, shouting condescending greeting to some favoured acquaintance, kissing some maiden who ventured too near, then up the street, roaring some scarcely decent song of the sea. How the cringers and the idlers, the hangers-on, would swarm about the two desperate heroes, flattering and smirking, guffawing hilariously at each nasty jest. For to the tavern loafers and to some of the weaker among the straightforward villagers, these men with their wild talk and their brutal deeds, their tales of the seven seas and the far countries, these men, I say, were valiant knights, nature's noblemen who dared to be men of blood and brawn. And all feared them, so that when a man was beaten or a woman insulted, the villagers muttered and did nothing. And so when Moll Farrell's niece was put to shame by John Kulrek, none dared even to put in words what all thought. Moll had never married, and she and the girl lived alone in a little hut down close to the beach, so close that in high tide the waves came almost to the door. The people of the village accounted old Moll something of a witch, and she was a grim, gaunt old dame who had little to say to anyone. But she minded her own business, and eked out a slim living by gathering clams and picking up bits of driftwood. The girl was a pretty, foolish little thing, vain and easily befooled, else she had never yielded to the shark-like blandishments of John Kulrek. I mind the day was a cold winter day, with a sharp breeze out of the east, when the old dame came into the village street, shrieking that the girl had vanished. All scattered over the beach and back among the bleak inland hills to search for her, all save John Kulrek and his cronies, who sat in the tavern dicing and toping. All the while beyond the shoals we heard the never-ceasing droning of the heaving, restless grey monster, and in the dim light of the ghostly dawn, Moll Farrell's girl came home. The tides bore her gently across the wet sands and laid her almost at her own door. Virgin white she was, and her arms were folded across her still bosom. Calm was her face, and the grey tide sighed about her slender limbs. Moll Farrell's eyes were stones, yet she stood above her dead girl and spoke no word till John Kulrek and his crony came reeling down from the tavern, their drinking-jacks still in their hands. Drunk was John Kulrek, and the people gave back for him, murder in their souls. So he came and laughed at Moll Farrell across the body of her girl. "Zounds," swore John Kulrek, "the wench has drowned herself, Lie-lip." Lie-lip laughed with a twist of his thin mouth. He always hated Moll Farrell, for it was she that had given him the name of Lie-lip. Then John Kulrek lifted his drinking-jack, swaying on his uncertain legs. "A health to the wench's ghost," he bellowed, while all stood aghast. Then Moll Farrell spoke, and the words broke from her in a scream which sent ripples of cold up and down the spines of the throng. "The curse of the foul fiend upon you, John Kulrek," she screamed. "The curse of God rest upon your vile soul throughout eternity. May you gaze on sights that shall sear the eyes of you and scorch the soul of you. May you die a bloody death and writhe in hell's flames for 1,000,000 and 1,000,000 and yet 1,000,000 years. I curse you by sea and by land, by earth and by air, by the demons of the oceans and the demons of the swamplands, the fiends of the forests and the goblins of the hills. And you—" her lean finger stabbed at Lie-lip Canool, and he started backward, his face paling. "You shall be the death of John Kulrek, and he shall be the death of you. You shall bring John Kulrek to the doors of hell, and John Kulrek shall bring you to the gallows tree. I set the seal of death upon your brow, John Kulrek. You shall live in terror and die in horror far out upon the cold grey sea. But the sea that took the soul of innocence to her bosom shall not take you, but shall fling forth your vile carcass to the sands. Aye, John Kulrek." And she spoke with such a terrible intensity that the drunken mockery on the man's face changed to one of swinish stupidity. "The sea roars for the victim it will not keep. There is snow upon the hills, John Kulrek, and ere it melts your corpse will lie at my feet, and I shall spit upon it and be content." Kulrek and his crony sailed at dawn for a long voyage, and Moll went back to her hut and her clam-gathering. She seemed to grow leaner and more grim than ever, and her eyes smouldered with a light not sane. The days glided by, and people whispered among themselves that Moll's days were numbered, for she faded to a ghost of a woman, but she went her way, refusing all aid. That was a short, cold summer, and the snow on the barren inland hills never melted, a thing very unusual, which caused much comment among the villagers. At dusk and at dawn, Moll would come up on the beach, gaze up at the snow which glittered on the hills, then out to sea with a fierce intensity in her gaze. Then the days grew shorter, the nights longer and darker, and the cold grey tides came sweeping along the bleak strands, bearing the rain and sleet of the sharp east breezes. And upon a bleak day, a trading vessel sailed into the bay and anchored, and all the idlers and the wastrels flocked to the wharfs, for that was the ship upon which John Kulrek and Lie-lip Canool had sailed. Down the gangplank came Lie-lip, more furtive than ever, but John Kulrek was not there. To shouted queries, Canool shook his head. "Kulrek deserted ship at a port of Sumatra," said he. "He had a row with the skipper lads. Wanted me to desert too, but no. I had to see you fine lads again, eh, boys?" Almost cringing was Lie-lip Canool, and suddenly he recoiled as Moll Farrell came through the throng. A moment they stood eyeing each other, then Moll's grim lips bent in a terrible smile. "There's blood on your hand, Canool," she lashed out suddenly, so suddenly that Lie-lip started and rubbed his right hand across his left sleeve. "Stand aside, witch," he snarled in sudden anger, striding through the crowd which gave back for him. His admirers followed him to the tavern. Now, I mind that the next day was even colder. Grey fogs came drifting out of the east and veiled the sea and the beaches. There would be no sailing that day, and so all the villagers were in their snug houses or matching tales at the tavern. So it came about that Joe, my friend, a lad of my own age, and I, were the ones who saw the first of the strange thing that happened. Being harum-scarum lads of no wisdom, we were sitting in a small rowboat, floating at the end of the wharfs, each shivering and wishing the other would suggest leaving, there being no reason whatever for our being there, save that it was a good place to build air castles undisturbed. Suddenly, Joe raised his hand. "Say," he said, "d'ye hear? Who can be out on the bay upon a day like this?" "Nobody. What d'ye hear?" Oars, or I'm a lubber. Listen. There was no seeing anything in that fog, and I heard nothing. Yet Joe swore he did, and suddenly his face assumed a strange look. Somebody rowing out there, I tell you. The bay is alive with oars from the sound. A score of boats at the least. You dolt, can you not hear? Then, as I shook my head, he leaped and began to undo the painter. I'm off to sea. Name me liar if the bay is not full of boats, altogether like a close fleet. Are you with me? Yes, I was with him, though I heard nothing. Then out in the greyness we went, and the fog closed behind and before, so that we drifted in a vague world of smoke, seeing naught and hearing naught. We were lost in no time, and I cursed Joe for leading us upon a wild goose chase that was like to end with our being swept out to sea. I thought of Moll Farrell's girl and shuddered. How long we drifted, I know not. Minutes faded into hours, hours into centuries. Still Joe swore he heard the oars, now close at hand, now far away, and for hours we followed them, steering our course toward the sound, as the noise grew or receded. This I later thought of, and could not understand. Then, when my hands were so numb that I could no longer hold the oar, and the forerunning drowsiness of cold and exhaustion was stealing over me, bleak white stars broke through the fog, which glided suddenly away, fading like a ghost of smoke, and we found ourselves afloat just outside the mouth of the bay. The waters lay smooth as a pond, all dark green and silver in the starlight, and the cold came crisper than ever. I was swinging the boat about, put back into the bay, when Joe gave a shout, and for the first time I heard the clack of oarlocks. I glanced over my shoulder, and my blood went cold. A great beaked prow loomed above us, a weird, unfamiliar shape against the stars, and as I caught my breath, sheered sharply and swept by us, with a curious swishing I never heard any other craft make. Joe screamed and backed oars frantically, and the boat walled out of the way just in time, for though the prow had missed us, still otherwise we had died. For from the sides of the ship stood long oars, bank upon bank, which swept her along. Though I had never seen such a craft, I knew her for a galley. But what was she doing upon our coasts? They said, the farfarers, that such ships were still in use among the heathens of Barbary, but it was many a long heaving mile to Barbary, and even so she did not resemble the ships described by those who had sailed far. We started in pursuit, and this was strange, for though the waters broke about her prow, and she seemed fairly to fly through the waves, yet she was making little speed, and it was no time before we caught up with her. Making our painter fast to a chain far back beyond the reach of the swishing oars, we hailed those on deck. But there came no answer, and at last, conquering our fears, we clambered up the chain and found ourselves upon the strangest deck man has trod for many a long, roaring century. "This is no Barbary rover," muttered Joe fearsomely. "Look, how old it seems. Almost ready to fall to pieces. Why, 'tis fairly rotten." There was no one on deck, no one at the long sweep with which the craft was steered. We stole to the hold and looked down the stair. Then and there, if ever men were on the verge of insanity, it was we. For there were rowers there, it is true. They sat upon the rowers' benches and drove the creaking oars through the grey waters, and they that rowed were skeletons. Shrieking, we plunged across the deck to fling ourselves into the sea. But at the rail I tripped upon something and fell headlong, and as I lay, I saw a thing which vanquished my fear of the horrors below for an instant. The thing upon which I had tripped was a human body, and in the dim grey light that was beginning to steal across the eastern waves, I saw a dagger hilt standing up between his shoulders. Joe was at the rail, urging me to haste, and together we slid down the chain and cut the painter. Then we stood off into the bay. Straight on kept the grim galley, and we followed, slowly, wondering. She seemed to be heading straight for the beach beside the wharfs, and as we approached, We saw the wharfs thronged with people. They had missed us, no doubt, and now they stood there in the early dawn light, struck dumb by the apparition which had come up out the night and the grim ocean. Straight on swept the galley, her oars a swish, and ere she reached the shallow water, crash! A terrific reverberation shook the bay. Before our eyes, the grim craft seemed to melt away. Then she vanished, and the green water seethed where she had ridden, but there floated no driftwood there, nor did there ever float any ashore. Aye, something floated ashore, but it was grim driftwood. We made the landing amid a hum of excited conversation that stopped suddenly. Moll Farrell stood before her hut, limbed gauntly against the ghostly dawn, her lean hand pointing seaward, and across the sighing wet sands, borne by the great tide, something came floating, something that the waves dropped at Moll Farrell's feet, and there looked up at us, as we crowded about, a pair of unseeing eyes set in a still, white face. John Kulrek had come home. Still and grim he lay, rocked by the tide, and as he lurched sideways, all saw the dagger hilt that stood from his back, the dagger all of us had seen 1,000 times, at the belt of Lie-lip Canool. "Aye, I killed him," came Canool's shriek, as he writhed and grovelled before our gaze. "At sea on a still night in a drunken brawl, I slew him and hurled him overboard, and from the far seas he has followed me." His voice sank to a hideous whisper. "Because of the curse, the sea would not keep his body." And the wretch sank down, trembling, the shadow of the gallows already in his eyes. Aye, strong, deep, and exultant was Moll Farrell's voice. From the hell of lost craft Satan sent a ship of bygone ages, a ship red with gore and stained with the memory of horrid crimes. None other would bear such a vile carcass. The sea has taken vengeance, and has given me mine. See now how I spit upon the face of John Kulrek. And with a ghastly laugh, she pitched forward, the blood starting to her lips. And the sun came up across the restless sea. When the Sea Gives Up Its Dead, by Robert Peery. With slow strokes I pushed my tiny craft among the dead brown grasses of the creek that wound its way over the flatlands of southern Carolina toward the distant sea. About me, as far as my eye could see, there stretched a level waste of melancholy sands topped with sparse, dead grasses. Now and then, a low-flying beach bird trailed its legs in dejection and uttered its long wailing cry, wending a dispirited way toward the quagmires of the swamplands in search of food. In the east, black clouds were banking toward the zenith. Jagged lightning darted eerily, blue and white and yellow, before the ominous ascension of the cloud masses. The wind was rising. The grasses bowed down to the water, as if accomplishing some ritual to a grey, forbidding god, and now and then, breaking the depressing silence, the slow mutter of 1,000 drums in the distance, the guttural complaint of the god of thunder, rolled up to me like waves of the sea, and receded again into a fearful silence. Loneliness. It is more than a word to one in a small boat upon the meandering stream that will carry one to the beaches of Carolina. Melancholy. The word upon that depressing shoreland drips with the ooze of despair when one's lips roundly utter its syllables. For many days I'd found myself becoming more and more depressed at being away from my family. Perhaps this depression, this saddened condition of my spirits, accounted for my being on that creek in my boat that late afternoon in September. I had not returned to the government camp with my fellow workers, but had turned my boat seaward, and had, by the time the storm broke, gone miles farther than any of us had been before. It was not a pleasant work in which we were engaged, this discouraging search for the breeding place of an insect that was destroying millions of dollars worth of crops annually. But someone had to do it, and the Bureau had selected me to head the investigation. My first intimation of the nearness of the storm came with a crash of thunder that followed hard upon the most tremendous lightning stroke I ever saw. The very heavens seemed to split asunder, and the echo of the thunder rolled almost endlessly against the grey, forbidding horizon. Then came the rain, a typical South Carolina coast rain, the beating sheets of grey water of those dreary savannas. I turned my boat about and began poling furiously upstream. Somewhere, I remembered, along the creek was a shack that had been pointed out to me as the habitation of an old beachcomber, an odd-job man of the neighboring town. I searched the landscape as I moved sluggishly up the stream. It was difficult to see any great distance through the grey avalanche of rain. But at last I espied the shack, set back about 50 yards from the marshy bank of the creek. I shunted the boat into the bank, tied it to a clump of small willows, and raced up the path toward the shelter of the shack. When I entered, the door was not locked, and I pushed it open without ceremony. The old man was kneeling before the open hearth, lighting a fire of grasses and driftwood. He turned his face when I entered, and said, with a note of petulance, I thought, "The hospitality of necessity." "I shall not trouble you long, only until the storm is over," I told him. "It is not pleasant panting along in the pouring rain, and then the lightning, you know." "Oh, you're welcome, as far as that goes," he said, in that whining, creaking voice that is so often an affectation of the aged. "Nobody can ever say that Sailor Jack ever turned a needy man from his door." He motioned me to take one of the 2 chairs with which the room was furnished, but I stood for a moment or so in the doorway under a small sheltering awning of planks, so that I might not wet the floor more than I could help. "Don't mind the water," he said. "Come on in and dry yourself by the fire." I complied, and when I was seated I looked about the room. I had heard many tales of Sailor Jack, tales the townfolk didn't believe, old sailor myths he'd strewn through the district. People wondered how he managed to live on the little work he got to do. In the room were 2 bunks, one above the other, sailor fashion, and in a corner an old chest of black carved wood. In a room at the back I could see a skillet hanging from a nail, and a small iron stove in which a fire was already lighted. A coffee pot was bubbling, and the faint aroma of good strong coffee came to my nostrils. A cup of coffee, I decided, would be just the thing to take the sudden chill from my body. Evidently Sailor Jack thought so too, because I saw him go into the kitchen and pour a cup from the pot. He was very old, was Sailor Jack. His face was wrinkled like old parchment, and his beard and hair were streaked with a yellowish tinge. The beard was splashed with brown stains from the lips to the tip of the white straggly growth. His eyes were hollows of madness. Upon his head was a curiously shaped blue cap, something similar to the cocky little hats that French sailors wear in port. He was terribly thin, and stooped, and old. He returned with a cup of coffee, which I drank without sugar or cream. It warmed me deliciously, and I forgot the raging wind and the rain for a moment or so. Sailor Jack seated himself in the other chair and lighted his knotty black pipe. "Bloody night," he said between puffs. English was Sailor Jack. "Bad storm," I said. "They don't last, though," he said, staring into the fire. "Be all over betimes the dance goes on." I stared at him rigidly. "The dance?" I queried. There was within the cabin only the puffy sound of his thin old lips over the stem of the black pipe and the licking whir of the flames on the logs of the hearth. Sailor Jack gazed abstractedly into the brightness of the fire, and spoke as if he were not talking to me, but only reiterating some thought that haunted him and must have utterance. It had grown quite dark outside, The lightning threw the windows into shimmering, dazzling flame at each forked bolt.
"The dance," said Sailor Jack. "The dance of the dead of the bark Greta. You must be a stranger to Pineville, else you would have heard ere now about how the men who perished when the Greta foundered offshore near here more than 50 years ago come back each dark of the moon to dance and drink above the grave. Always at the hour of 9 at night they come whimpering out of their sea graves to dance upon the grave of Naker. Always at 9, because that was the hour at which we buried her. 9 of the night when the moon was dark."
A heavy blast of the wind tore the door from its fastenings, and the rain swept into the room. Sailor Jack got to his unsteady feet, and together we shut the door and tied the leather thong more securely.
"Tonight is the night for them. Be a wild night, but what do the dead care? Aye, what do they care? It is the living who suffer."
Is there a story?" I asked.
"Aye, lad, well, you ask if there is a story. A story of goblins and the sea dead. Her body never rests beneath the waves. All will tell you that. The earth is a man's proper burial ground, and the poor spirits of the dead doomed to a watery grave are never at rest. I hear 'em coming up across the savannas to dance their monthly rituals. Always at Naker's grave, too. I know where she was buried. I helped cover her wasted body."
"When? Where?" I began, drawing my chair closer to the fire.
"Of course," he said. "You're wanting to hear, and it's me as would be telling you about the night we buried the poor brown body of the dead Naker. She's never at rest, and the ship's crew, it never rests. This all happened, lad, more than 50 years ago, when I was a strapping lad myself, and mate of the bark Greta, kneeled at Bedford by Durwood, who was one of the best of the builders in those old days. A sweet ship she was, as easy to handle with dry sticks up above as when she was all plain sail with heavy jib and spanker. Sweet to the helm as a brood mare. A bird of a ship, lad. She'd never have foundered off the savannas if 3/4 of the crew had not been down with the fever, the tropic fever as Naker give 'em. But you don't know about Naker, do you? Naker was mine in the beginning. I found her at the wharf at Pamity, and she begged me to bring her home with me. I did, or I started with her. I smuggled her aboard at night, and she kept herself stowed away for 3 days after we pulled anchor from the harbour. She was a beauty, lad. Brown, seductive, limbs and a face as any man might have fancied. The captain, Biderman his name was, the dirty lying dog, he took her away from me, and we fought for her. And he won. I was near wild, I tells you, lad, for I loved her, and he only wanted her for his evil purposes. Well, we was coming home under a good wind with all sail aloft, whipping it in easy after touching Montevideo on the coast of South America. Bedford was our next point of call, and at Bedford, I had figured it out, was where I'd leave the ship. With Naker, you understand. But I reckoned without consulting that fate that follows the sailor. Naker took down with a fever. She died, and never once did that beast of a Biderman let me see her. We anchored offshore here.
Sailor Jack pointed to the east and resumed his tale.
The captain detailed the 5 of us to bury Naker on the beach. She'd made him promise her he'd give her a decent burial on land, and he meant to keep the promise. She knew the dead at sea never rested, for Naker was wise with the wisdom of women. They shrouded her body in a sheet and lowered it away into the bumboat, and we pulled to shore. It was at 9 o'clock that we digged the grave. Before we buried her, I swept back her shroud to see her face for the last time. I touched her eyelids and said a little prayer for the peace of her soul. I touched her little brown hands. I saw the ring on her finger. I drew back in surprise. The last link of her spirit with me, who really loved her, was gone. The ring I'd given her was gone, and in its stead was a ruby set about with green stones, the whole set in a gold band. I knew it was Biderman's ring. I wanted to snatch that ring from the finger, but something held me back. The men of the crew who watched me at my prayer warned me of the dreadful penalty that follows the robbing of the dead. So it was that we buried Neka, the beautiful, the beloved, on the sands of the beach behind a rotting hull of a ship's boat.
The storm was decreasing now. I had leaned forward under the strange spell of the old man's words. His eyes were beginning to fill with tears. His breath became more laboured.
But she was never allowed a moment's rest from that night to this. Her soul, that she wanted buried in decent Christian ground, is desecrated by the terrible carousals of the crew of the brig Greta. For the Greta foundered that night, trying to draw off the shore. The crew was short on account of the fever Neka had spread among them, and she went down before a single boat could be lowered. I was strong, and I swam ashore, and was saved.
He grew silent then, and I feared to question him. It was so evident that his mind was filled with the memory of the burial of his beloved Neka. It was an almost unbelievable tale. I cast about in my own mind for reasons to doubt his story, but the crowding memories were so plain in his dim old eyes that I could do naught but believe.
"They will not let her spirit rest,"
cried Sailor Jack. He sprang to his feet and cast his arms upward and raised his head to stare at the ceiling.
"They dance their fiendish dances over her grave at every dark of the moon. They drink their rum and sing their braggart songs above her grave, and her spirit is never still. Biderman leads their drunken revels."
I stepped to his side and helped him back to his chair.
"Forgive me,"
he said softly, his head bowed into his hands.
"I forget myself when I think of Neka's soul that never rests."
I looked at my watch. It was after 8 o'clock. "I think I'll try it back," I said to him. "The rain has stopped." He rose and confronted me.
"No,"
he answered.
"You must go with me tonight to watch the dance of the dead at Neka's grave. It is not too far across the marsh. Come, and I will show you that I am telling the truth. Come, and you will hear the creaking of the sails of the Greta. You will hear the lowering boats and the landing. You will hear all I have said you would hear, but you will see nothing. No man is privileged to see save me. I alone must bear the horror of the sight."
I made feeble protest, but he only stared into my eyes and placed his hands on my shoulders in entreaty. "I will go," I said at last. He went then into the kitchen and prepared a supper of bacon and milk with a hard bread he had made of cornmeal. We washed this coarse fare down with great cups of hot coffee. When we had finished, he went into a cupboard and fetched an old ship's lantern, lighted it, and set it down near the door. He delved into the trunk, or chest of black wood, and brought forth a silk scarf of blue and an old curved scimitar.
"We will go now," he said.
He led the way along a path that curved around the house toward the sea. For an hour I walked behind him. We passed no word between us. The lightning had passed around us, and now made futile yellow glares in the southwest. The wind still swept in gusts over the wet brown grass of the savannah. I began to suspect something of the foolishness of the night's affair. Why should I be here with this crazed old man? What would my friends at the camp 4 miles up the stream think of my absence? They perhaps might set out to search for me. I was just on the point of stopping the old sailor when he turned off the path and sat down in the sand behind a clump of willows. I could hear the rushing of the waves along the beach that could not be very far away. His hand touched my shoulder. He extinguished the lantern.
"There is the place. You can see the ribs of the old boat half buried in the sand of the beach. It is beneath the bow of that rotting old boat that Neka is buried. The stream enters the bay just there, the stream you came down this afternoon. Our way was shorter, that is all."
I settled myself into the sand beside him and waited.
"What is the time?"
he asked. "Almost 9 o'clock," I replied.
I will know when 9 comes, he said. I will hear the flapping of the sails of the Greta as they pull her inshore.
I will make no effort here to say what I heard that night. I can only say what I, under the recurring monotone of his voice, thought he made me hear. The space before us was possibly 50 yards wide, running to the right into a dark clump of willows and large grasses. To our left, the same. Between were the lapping wavelets of the sea and the sand of the beach, in the centre of which I could just distinguish the black ribs of a ship's boat, buried quite more than half its depth in the sand. The willows nodded and shifted in the wind. Complete silence pervaded this deserted strip of beach, except for the heavy, wheezy breathing of Sailor Jack. That was the only sound. I did not hear the first sound, but I knew that Sailor Jack did. His skinny, claw-like hand almost cut into my flesh with the tenacity and the fear with which he gripped my arm. He sat half erect.
"The sails! The Greta is pulling inshore!"
I listened intently. The sound was of bellying sails, booming low, but quite audible down the wind. There was then a clanking, a creaking, a sound so tiny that I feared for an instant that I was only imagining I heard. Sailor Jack had not released his grip upon my arm.
"The boat is going over. There will be 2 of them lowered. You will hear. I have heard every month for 50 years. They are coming to dance their terrible rituals of sacrilege over the grave of Naka, so that her soul can have no rest."
The flesh of my body tightened perceptibly. The sounds were real. I could no longer doubt their reality, try as hard as I might. I heard the splash of lifted oars, the scraping of a boat upon the sand, and nowhere the sight of any moving thing or human figure. Had I seen any tangible substance, a wraith, a moving ghostly figure, it would not have been so terrifying to my spirits, my nerves. But there was nothing except the rattle of phantom chains and the splash of shadowy oars in the surf. It seemed to me that the waves grew larger at the point where I had heard the scraping of a boat's keel along the sand.
"They will roll their casks of rum along the sand,"
said Sailor Jack. His voice startled me. I looked at his face. Every muscle was drawn in horror.
"They will stamp their feet upon Naka's grave in a ghost dance. They hate Naka, Naka, whom I loved with all my soul and my heart. Naka comes to my cabin at night and lays her woes at my feet. Her lips touch mine in a kiss that is of her hungry, searching soul."
His voice grew louder in his wild, demoniacal denunciation of the despoilers of his sweetheart's grave. My mind grew weary with the dreadful thoughts that thronged its avenues. The dance began. Smothered voices, the clinking of mugs, the low, shrill laughter of drunken men. Sounds without bodies capable of producing them. It is indescribable.
"Come," said Sailor Jack. "It is time to avenge her desecration. I shall slay the spirit of Biderman, who leads these ghastly revels."
He sprang with a loud cry from his hiding place behind the willows and ran, crouching, toward the hull of the boat. The sounds died away. There was none except the soft murmur of the wind in the willows. I sprang behind him, quite confident now that he had gone mad. He was brandishing the scimitar at an unseen adversary, close to the rotting hull of the boat.
Die, die, grave wreckers, destroyers of the peace of souls!"
Suddenly, he stumbled back into my arms. It was almost as if some tremendous blow had been delivered upon his head. His scimitar, rusted, useless thing that it was, fell from his grasp. Sailor Jack was dead. I bent over him, not daring to move, cold with a sudden fear. The sounds had begun again. I dared not look. The rattling of boat hooks, the creaking of windlasses, the bellying and the popping of sails. I heard them all, and I dared not raise my head. I knelt there in the sand above the grave of Naka, and held the poor old body of Sailor Jack in my arms. I tried later to bring him back to his cabin, but the burden was too great. I set off alone in the darkness then, found my boat, and went to the camp for help. We brought Sailor Jack to Pineville, and left his body with the local undertaker. I told no one of the night's affair, except that I was on the beach with the old man when he died. The local doctor pronounced it heart failure. The next afternoon, I went alone to the beach where the rotting hull still stood half buried in the sand. I found Sailor Jack's scimitar and the blue silk sash. I had brought a spade along with me, and I began excavating the sand upon the spot where the old man had engaged his ghostly enemy in combat. I had not to dig long. I came at length upon a sort of white earth, the crumbled remains of human bones, and a little to one side I found a ring, a ruby set about with green stones in a gold band. Left by the Tide by Edward E. Schiff. Were it not for that 4-inch scar upon my forehead, I would have thought it a nightmare, some ghastly hallucination, even though it happened in broad daylight. But there is that scar which mars my features for life, tangible and terrible evidence to prove that I did not dream it. I had gone down to the beach with the rising sun, but I was the only one there. None of the other guests from the hotel had yet come down to take their early morning plunge. A charity affair that did not break up till 3 o'clock that morning kept them abed, so I was alone upon that sun-drenched stretch of sand. The tide was low, and I had to walk some 100 yards before I was waist-deep and breasting the invigorating waters of old ocean. I swam out at once to a pile of rocks, a good quarter of a mile from the shore, and climbed out upon them. Now, at low tide, they formed a nearly circular, barnacle and weed-covered island, about 50 feet in diameter, and rising only a few feet above the waters. After resting a few minutes, I clambered over the jagged stones toward the center, where there was a depression about 6 or 7 feet deep, and about the same width, and where the retreating waters sometimes left strange denizens of the deep, which could be observed under ideal conditions. Just before I reached the little pool, I thrilled to the sound of a splash of a heavy body. The tide had left something there with a vengeance, I thought gleefully, and I hastened forward to see what it was. I stared, sickened by what I saw. A dead man, with shriveled, shrunken skin, hollow cheeks, and hideous in apparently the last stages of putrefaction. There he was, floating on his back a bare few inches below the surface. His hands were under him, and at first I thought he was naked. Then, as I overcame my first horror, I noted that he had a sort of apron about his loins, an apron made of what appeared to be the scales of a large fish. It was a curious garment, and covered with green algae or sea moss. The man must have been dead for a long time to have allowed for the formation of that slime. I puzzled over this, wondering how it was he remained whole and not half devoured by the scavengers of the sea. Then suddenly I remembered the splash I had heard. Who had made it? Not the dead man. Closely I searched the pool for some other sign of life, but except for a sea crab or two, there was none. Turning my attention to the body again, I scrutinized it closely, and felt my scalp twitch when I thought I detected a barely perceptible rising and falling of the chest. The more I stared, the more certain I was that I was not mistaken. But drowned men do not breathe, I told myself. I must be laboring under a hallucination. I turned my eyes away and gazed out over the sea and sky to rest them, and when I turned them back again, I was shocked into an exclamation. The body had moved toward me. I could still see the faint traces of the eddy it had made to reach me. But dead men cannot move, and there was no wave or tide or any breath of wind that could propel it within that enclosed space. Now I was certain it was breathing. The slight but definitely regular expansion and contraction of the chest were caused by respiration. I could not be mistaken. Then suddenly the lids flashed open, and I was staring into its eyes. And they were the eyes of a living creature, sea-green and evil, that probed through mine into the very recesses of my brain with satanic curiosity. Then, still holding me with its baleful gaze, the thing reached for the brink with huge hands that were webbed like those of some aquatic bird, and started to pull itself up. Somehow I broke the spell by which the thing held me, and, half mad with loathing and horror, I kicked him with my bare foot back into the pool. I think I stumbled half back to the open water before I recovered my courage and paused to look back. It had come out of the pool and was dragging its slimy length over the rocks toward me. I realized at once it could not walk upright, and that I would have no difficulty in evading it. With unmitigated loathing I watched it crawl until it approached to within a few feet of me. Then I backed away from it, taking care to avoid being crowded into the sea, where it could easily outmaneuver me with its fin-like appendages. Again it tried to hold me with its hypnotic stare, but I avoided its eyes, and, stooping down, picked up a fragment of rock and tried to threaten it back. Suddenly it, too, reached out and picked up a stone, and we both threw at the same moment. But I was completely beside myself with horror and missed him by inches, while he caught me fairly on the chest, a blow that knocked the breath out of me and dropped me to my knees. The next moment he was upon me, his powerful hands closing about my throat, his cold, slimy body against my cringing, warm flesh, his fetid breath in my nostrils. But I fought in a stark, frenzied madness that promised to rid me of his clinging, hateful weight, when suddenly he released one of his hands from my throat, and I could feel him fumble around his waist. The next moment I would have been free of him, but his hand came up again, wielding a stone or coral knife. I screamed and tried to evade the blow, but while I spoiled his aim for my throat, he managed to inflict that awful gash on my forehead. When I came back to consciousness, it was with a cry of terror, in the arms of two men who were lifting me into a skiff, and for some minutes I struggled with them, before I realized they were my rescuers. Their story is briefly told. They had observed me from the beach, apparently trying to avoid some creature which they thought was a seal. They quickly got into a skiff and rowed to the rocks, shouting to frighten off the creature when they saw me struggling with it. Then, for a minute or two, I was out of their sight, hidden by a projecting rock, and when they again saw me I was alone and lying flat on my back, though a moment before they had heard the thing splash into the sea. That is their story. Mine they would not believe. In fact, they tried to stop me in the telling of it, and attempted to soothe me as if I were a terror-stricken child, or crazy. They said I had injured my forehead by falling on a jagged stone, but that day 2 bathers were pulled down to their death by some creature of the sea. Sharks, they all said, but I know better. The Seven Seas Are One by Alison V. Harding. Dr. John Ogilvy opened his front door in answer to the insistent ringing. Outside stood an aged, agitated little woman. "Why, Mrs. Ives," said the doctor in surprise. "It's rather late to see you abroad." "It's the captain, doctor," fluttered the woman, wringing her hands. "Please come with me. He's not right again." "What do you mean, not right?" "He's talking queer, doctor, and he's sitting up in his room with a loaded pistol on his lap, rolling his eyes and carrying on to scare the saints. I get so worried." The little old woman looked as though she was about to burst into tears. "Sometimes I tell myself I should stop housekeeping, but Captain Tyler needs me. At any rate, he needs somebody." Her hands waved helplessly in accompaniment to the oft-repeated tale. Dr. Ogleby put on his hat and coat and went out the door with her. "Of course you walked, Mrs. Ives. Nary a person would stop to give me a lift, Doctor. Well, we'll take my car to go back out. It's getting dark, and a 2-mile walk would keep us away from him just that much longer. How is his rheumatism, Mrs. Ives?" Her brow puckered as she followed him into his little coupe. "Praise us! That is the least of my worries with all this queer talk he's doing." As they started off down a back road of Little Clarksville, the small New England town was even then at 9 o'clock, readying itself for the night. The yellow glow from the headlights probed forward along the desolate lane that led to Captain Tyler's. Mrs. Ives was silent now, fatigued by her walk into town. Dr. Ogleby sorted over in his mind what he knew about the old seafarer. What he knew indeed! It was next to nothing. Precious little. Tyler was an old sailor. He had been master of his own ship and lived 2 miles outside town in a little house, the rent for which was covered by his monthly retirement stipend. Mrs. Ives, a reliable character of the town, who, with her kin, had made serving others their profession, kept the old sailor's home for him, cleaning and getting an occasional meal. Dr. Ogleby was necessary because of the attacks of rheumatism that the captain was liable to develop at any time. Dr. Ogleby remembered the first time he had seen Tyler. He was impressed with the bigness of the man, the frank brutality of his weather-beaten face. "I get these pains, Doc," roared the old ship's master. "My legs and my back, they get hurting something awful. You'll fix me up, eh?" And Dr. Ogleby said he'd be glad to do his best. He noted at the first examination that physically the captain was as strong as an ox. Dr. Ogleby pulled the nose of his little car into the driveway and braked to a stop. With Mrs. Ives bustling along ahead, the physician stepped into the house. "He's upstairs," said the housekeeper. Dr. Ogleby nodded silently and started up the flight leading to the top floor. There was a roar from above. "Avast there, you seacock, I hear you coming." Mrs. Ives trotted up the steps back of the doctor. "You see, that's what he was doing all afternoon. He seems to think somebody's after him." Ogleby reached the top of the stairs. The old seamaster's room was directly before him, the door to it open. Seated in an ancient rocker just inside was Captain Tyler, his clothes disarranged, a mad light in his eyes, and a derringer lying on his knee. As the physician stepped toward him, the seafarer made a move to reach for his gun. His hand closed excitedly over the stock of his weapon, and he exploded some curses. "It's only me, Captain Tyler," hurried the doctor. "You're not feeling well, I see. I want to help you. Now, tell me what's the matter." The old man broke at that, and his hands fell slackly at his sides. Dr. Ogleby tactfully removed the small derringer and placed it on the bureau. He noted that Tyler's face was white and bore signs of strain. "Come now, get yourself over here and I'll examine you." Tyler hobbled over to the bed and stretched out, muttering all the while to himself. "It's good you came, Doctor," he gasped. "It's good you came. There's been a bad wind blowing around here lately. Means trouble. I can feel it, you know. I think he's coming. That's what I've been saying to myself all day. I've been saying to myself, Captain, watch out. He'll be back soon now." "Who's he?" asked the doctor curiously. But Tyler's answer was an unintelligible muttering punctuated by some more oaths. After satisfying himself that there was nothing of a physical nature wrong with Tyler, Dr. Ogleby urged a strong sedative on the old man and went softly out of the room. Mrs. Ives was waiting impatiently downstairs. "What do you make out of all this, Doctor?" she said eagerly. "Well, he seems very upset about something. He doesn't complain about his rheumatism, though, and I find nothing else wrong with him. I think he'll sleep it off. Nothing unusual's happened lately, has it?" "No," said the housekeeper thoughtfully. "Except—" "Except what?" said the doctor. "Oh, I don't think there's any connection, but he has 2 closets up in his room. One he keeps locked all the time. I was cleaning in his room yesterday, and I tried the locked door absent-mindedly. He was sitting in the room, and he started to curse. Well, you know how he goes on. After I went downstairs, he locked the door to his room, and I couldn't help hearing that he went to the closet and opened it. He's done this before, and it always seems to upset him. I hear him grumbling and cursing and talking as if actually to somebody." "He probably keeps a bit of rum in there," said Ogleby wryly. "Although I must admit there's no trace tonight that he's been drinking. You don't usually stay here all night, do you, Mrs. Ives?" The elderly woman shook her head. "I think if you could, though, it would be better. He should sleep right through until tomorrow, and I have every anticipation that he'll be all right when he wakes up. But a man of his age shouldn't be completely alone when he's so upset, no matter what the cause. I wouldn't mind telling him that I suggested you stay, and I'm sure he'd pay you for your time." "Oh, it isn't that at all, Doctor," said Mrs. Ives hastily. "I don't mind when a poor soul is sick, but it's kind of lonely out here, and his strange talk today made me feel sort of creepy. There's so much darkness around this little cottage. It's lonely. There's woods all around us except the side where the sea comes in. Oh, I've been here a few nights, you know. One time, you remember, when he was very bad with rheumatism." The doctor nodded. "He's not a very sociable old codger, I guess." "All there is the sound of the sea and the wind," Mrs. Ives shuddered. "Still, if you think I ought—" "I do," said Dr. Ogleby, "and if you can, I'd feel better about it." He took 2 white pellets out of his bag. "If he wakes up in the night and you hear him, give him these." The doctor closed his black bag with a snap and headed toward the car. "I'll drop by sometime tomorrow, Mrs. Ives." Then he was gone, and the sound of his car finally receded into the distance, leaving only sighing wind and the sound of the nearby sea lapping at the sun-baked summer earth. Mrs. Ives made very sure of the windows and doors of the cottage before she lay down on the couch. Almost laughing at herself, she took the heavy poker from the fireplace and placed it on a chair at her side. Then, with the light off, she tried to relax, staring up at the ceiling and wondering about the old man upstairs, who had kept insisting that he was coming. The housekeeper thought with a chill that he was probably not very nice. Else why would an unimaginative and resourceful man like Shipmaster Tyler wait for him with a loaded pistol and a white, haunted face? The next day, when Dr. Ogleby called, Captain Tyler was his old, gruff, blustering self, with seemingly no remembrance of the preceding day. He was hardly civil to Ogleby, and before the physician could say much, the captain had headed off down toward the shore. Mrs. Ives reported nothing unusual, and Ogleby went away thinking that all was well. But it was only a week later when Ogleby received another hurry call to come out to the Tyler cottage on the sea-coast. This time a messenger brought word, Mrs. Ives not wanting to leave the old man. When the physician arrived, he found the housekeeper highly perturbed downstairs. "He's fired that gun off," she expostulated. "Gracious, but I think he's right out of his head." "Long as you're all right, Mrs. Ives," said the doctor, hurrying up the stairs. This time the door to Tyler's room was shut, and locked, the doctor soon found out. He rapped sharply on the panel, and a hoarse guttural sound came from within. "Captain Tyler, it's Dr. Ogleby." There was a curse, and the sound of some furniture knocked over. "Go away," roared the old sailor. Now, Captain," soothed Ogleby from outside. "Please let me in. I'm sorry you're ill. I want to help you." Finally, there was the sound of the lock, and Captain Tyler flung the door open. As the panel slid aside, Ogleby found himself facing a pistol. "Put that thing down, man." Tyler still retained enough of his senses to recognize the doctor, and allowed the pistol to be taken from his hand. Even so, Captain Tyler stepped to the door and called downstairs to Mrs. Ives. "Ahoy below there! Keep a sharp eye out for strangers. Keep things battened down." With that he closed the door, locked it, and turned to Ogleby almost pathetically. "Didn't see nobody around when you came, did you, Doc?" The physician shook his head. "But why, Captain? Tell me, what's it all about? Do you have reason to believe somebody wants to make trouble for you?" The old sailor smiled at that. "Trouble, you say, Doc? Well, now, I wouldn't say quite trouble. He means to kill me." "What?" said Dr. Ogleby, shocked. "Who is this person, and why do you think he's after you?" With that, the bulky figure turned away. "Reckon it's nobody's business but mine." "But, Captain, is it one of the people in Clarksville?" But Tyler shrugged and would say no more. "Think he's a mite touched, Doctor?" said Mrs. Ives later downstairs. Ogleby frowned. "It's hard to pass judgment on a thing like that. He acts perfectly normal most of the time." "Oh, he treats me fine," answered Mrs. Ives hastily. "Pays me well, he does. Treats me kind. Short and irritable sometimes, you understand. But he's a reasonable gentleman, I always say. Of course he swears, but men folks do that, especially sailors." "He's got no people, has he?" mused the physician. "Not so far as I've been able to find out," replied the housekeeper definitely. "Well," the medical man concluded, "at least his rheumatism isn't bothering him much these days. By the way, you haven't been able to find out who this person is he thinks wants to harm him?" "No," said Mrs. Ives. Then, as an afterthought, "Maybe he's possessed." Ogleby smiled. "Well, Mrs. Ives, if the captain needs me, just get in touch any time." The captain needed Dr. Ogleby just 3 days later. "He's dead!" screamed Mrs. Ives over a neighbor's telephone to the physician. "He drowned himself out there on the shore. Lord of mercy, we never would have found him if it hadn't been for the neighbor's boy. At least, I think he's dead. Oh, doctor, hurry, hurry. They say he's got some warmth in him yet." Ogleby raced out in his car and found Captain Tyler in unconscious, cold white form. His heart was still beating, though, and the old sailor's iron constitution was staving off the effects of his near drowning. After getting him in bed and giving the proper medications, Ogleby went downstairs, where a tall, gangling lad of about 17 was waiting with Mrs. Ives. "How is he, doctor?" said the housekeeper. "Oh, he'll be all right," said Ogleby. "He's got tremendous strength, you know. How did this business happen?" Mrs. Ives spread her arms wide. "It was Harley here who found him." The medical man turned to the young lad. "What happened?" The boy was still upset by his experience, and his words came haltingly. "You see, I was walking down by the coast. I got some lines set offshore, and I was checking them when I came up to the little beach on the captain's property, and I saw him walking along, waving his hands and talking as though somebody else were there with him. Naturally, I watched. He started walking away from the water toward his cottage. Then all of a sudden his hands came out like somebody was about to wrestle or fight. Honest, it looked as though he was about to fight with somebody. And then he goes staggering down the beach like he was drunk or somebody's pushed him, and in a twink he's in the water up to his shoulders, clothes and all. Then I see him go under, only he doesn't come up again. Naturally, I don't like to interfere in the beginning, but when I see this, I think he's in some trouble, so I run as fast as I can out there and go in after him and pull him up on the beach. He weren't in very long, but long enough to get a lot of water into him, and it's coming out of his mouth and nose. He was unconscious, so I yelled, and finally Mrs. Ives heard me and came down. She took one look and said, 'He's dead,' and I got thinking first maybe he was. He looked so cold and so white, but I did like we were taught in the Scouts." The boy made pushing movements with his 2 hands. "Of course, at first, even if you think the guy's dead, you should work on him." Dr. Ogleby nodded in approval and slapped the boy on the shoulder. "Between us, we dragged him up to the house, and then Mrs. Ives ran over to my place and called you. Then he got to breathing a bit on his own. I'm glad he's all right." "You did fine, Harley," commended the doctor. The boy enjoyed the praise, but then looked worried. "There was something awful funny about the way he carried on, though." Mrs. Ives frowned. "When you're the captain's age, maybe you'll take a couple of drinks sometimes. Better be running along home, Harley. I'm going to tell your mother what a good smart lad you are." The boy winked and grinningly departed. "I don't want it getting around that the captain's a crazy man," said the housekeeper indignantly. "If only for my sake. I don't want anybody to think I work for somebody possessed by demons." "I'm going to go up and have another talk with him," said the doctor. "I think we've got to find out what's preying on his mind." Mrs. Ives shrugged. "Sometimes it's a mistake to look into these things too closely, Doctor. If there's strange forces at work, if the captain hears and sees things that we don't, that's the Almighty's work, and we don't want to butt our way into it. I'll be very careful, Mrs. Ives, you may be sure." reassured the medical man, heading upstairs. Captain Tyler's eyes followed Dr. Ogilvy across the room from door to bedside. Drawing up a chair close by, the physician seated himself, reached over, and patted one of the sailor's huge hairy paws. Some colour had come back into his patient's face, but the man's eyes were feverish and troubled. "Just what happened to you, Captain?" said Ogilvy. The ex-seafarer bared his teeth in a ghoulish grin. "Aye, and don't you know it's him, Doc? I knew he'd come back, and he's here. He almost got me today, too, didn't he? Now, man, you've got to stop this talk about him. Who is he? If somebody's bothering you, let us know. There are laws against that sort of thing." "No laws, Doctor." The old man wagged his head. Ogilvy shook his head impatiently. "If you don't care to tell me," he started. The captain rolled eyes dilated with fear toward him. "Sure, I'll tell you, Doc. A tale that'll make your hair stand on end. And it's true, bless me, every word of it." Ogilvy laid a soothing hand against his patient's shoulder. "Now take it easy, Tyler," he said. "You went through an ordeal this afternoon. Maybe this isn't the time." "Maybe it is," roared the old man, and he cursed vehemently for a few minutes. "Then you can see the sort of weather I'm headed into." Ogilvy saw that it would upset his patient more to oppose him than to let him get the yarn off his chest. Anyway, he felt a natural curiosity. "All right, let's have it." The ex-skipper dug his elbows into the bed and hitched himself a notch higher. "It was on my last trip, Doc. We were coming back from South America with a mixed cargo. My ship was poorly manned that trip, and I had a bad one for my first mate. He didn't like me, and I didn't like him from the first day we sighted each other in Savannah Harbor. That's when he joined up with me. Well, you don't always like the men that serve under you, and they don't always like you. But this time it was more than that. I think the fates meant us to hate each other, sort of a foreshadow of what was going to happen. At Montevideo we picked up a few passengers. 6 of them were women. All went well, until we're about 3/4 of the way up the South American coast, when one of the worst storms I've ever seen in that part of the world blew up. Still, I would have bet on the old Betsy May, that was her name, riding out almost anything, when we had to go and drop a screw. Then the first mate went crazy, and without orders from me, turned the Betsy May toward where the coastline was, 50 or 60 miles away. Before I could countermand his orders, we had taken the full weight of the sea across our beam, and the Betsy May sprang a dozen leaks all at once. Even as I cursed the mate and set the helmsman right, I knew from the way the old girl rowed now that she was doomed." Captain Tyler wrung his giant hands together, as though he was still standing on the bridge that fateful night. "I had Sparks send out distress signals, but we found there was no ship within 6 hours of us. I knew that in that heavy sea we stood only a slim chance in open boats and rafts, but the mate on his own hook began to ready the lifeboats. I saw red then, and I almost shot him for insubordination. I could have, too. I warned him to wait until he got his orders from me. By this time, the Betsy May had a list of at least 45 degrees, and the pumps were fighting a losing battle against the water pouring into her hold. Finally, I knew if we waited much longer, we'd be carried down with the vessel, so I had the lifeboats that hadn't been wrecked by the storm lowered, and rafts thrown into the sea. Very few of us made it, but I jumped in and found my way to a small raft capable of holding 5 or 6 people. Somehow, several of the women were clustered aboard this raft. I was able to pick another of the women out of the water, although we hardly had space for her. Every now and then we would be completely covered up as waves and spray poured over us. So overcrowded we seemed on the verge of turning over into that boiling sea at any moment. Suddenly I felt our raft dip dangerously, and several of the women screamed. I looked down and saw a pair of hands clutching the side of the boat. One of the women started to moan. The others were crying. It seemed any moment our raft would turn over, and all of us plunged into the sea. The swimmer, whoever he was trying to hoist himself onto the raft, and we could all see he would upset it. I knew the other occupants could never have lasted in that sea again more than a few minutes. Then I saw who he was. It was the mate there in the water, snarling and gripping our raft and raising himself up on it. I yelled at him over the sound of the storm, and he screamed back at me. And then instinctively I hit him. I smashed at his hands on the side of the raft. It was either him or all of us. I knew it, and the other people on the raft knew it. Then he got a fist grip on the front of my jacket. I cursed the strength of that master's coat I'd always been so proud of. Cursed as he held on, his fingers hooked around a button and some of the cloth. One of the women, with frenzied strength, helped me wrench his one hand loose from the side. But it was I who struck him on the head with all my strength. His weight slumped back in the water, almost pulling me overboard. Then there was a wrench and a ripping of cloth, and I was free. The mate's other hand had torn loose from my jacket, and he went under. He sank right straight down, slowly. Straight as a statue he went, as though there were a weight tied to his feet. But all the time his eyes were open, and he stared at me. From under the water he did, I tell you, and even after the rest of his body had gone out of sight, I could see his eyes burning up at me out of the water, his two eyes looking up at me, and I knew what he was saying. I knew he was swearing revenge. I don't know how long I kept seeing his eyes way down there burning up through the water, but I swear I did for hours. Finally, the sea calmed and light showed in the east. Not long afterward, we were picked up. Everybody on the raft was very grateful to me, and not one ever said anything about the mate. They all knew it was him or all of us, but I kinda knew he meant to follow me wherever I went. Captain Tyler shrugged in his bed. That was my last trip. It's hard for a sailor to lose his ship on the last trip like that, but my record had always been very good, and I was over the age limit. So I came here. A landlubber finally, but as close to the sea as I could get. I'd die without the sea, Doc. Tyler looked at Ogleby intently. There, that's the tale. Ogleby hummed and then reasoned. But surely you don't really believe that a dead man can come thousands of miles up here to get revenge? I can see that you have that adventure clearly in your mind, and that naturally you feel remorseful about it. Still, as you've described it to me, you could have done nothing else that night. Come now, man, you can't go on brooding about it. The experience, horrible as it was, can't affect you now. At that, Captain Tyler flew into a rage. Why, you idiot, I saw him, I tell you. I saw him sink right before me. His eyes were looking at me as he went down. He was dead, but he was still looking at me, his eyes shining up out of the water. He was talking to me, he was, and I understood what he said. Dr. Ogleby shook out some white tablets onto the bed table. Now, Captain, he soothed, you're going to be all right. If you feel restless, just take one of these. I'm going to ask Mrs. Ives to stay in the house with you a few nights, and if you need me, you can get her to go over to the neighbors and phone. I'm sure you're going to be all right again. You realize how much better your rheumatism's been lately? The physician added brightly. Damn the rheumatism, man. I've got me something real to worry about this time. Ogleby started toward the door. You'll see, roared the captain. But I'm aiming to fight. What can you fight, Captain? Said Ogleby, pausing, his hand on the knob. Captain Tyler shook his shaggy head, and worry pushed his face into a grimace. I don't know, he said. I guess I brought it on myself, and there's not much I can do. I know he's here. When I first bunked into this place, I thought it could be he wouldn't find me. But then one day I got the feeling. Doc, I got the feeling that he was here. I get it from the sea, you understand. It doesn't make any difference that this place is thousands of miles away from where the Betsy May went down. What's that to a dead man? And Captain Tyler threw back his head and laughed. You take a couple of those pills, called Dr. Ogleby as he pulled open the door. All right, me hearty, said Tyler. Downstairs, the physician spoke to Mrs. Ives. He's very upset. This thing has been a great shock to him. Did you find out anything more about this person he thinks is after him? Said the curious old woman. He's not very clear about all that, evaded the doctor. But he sure believes it awful hard, countered Mrs. Ives. Let's see. It was the hardware man's son who was kind of crazy here a few years ago. He used to go around with a shotgun. Never did anything bad, but sure scared a lot of folks out of their wits. Them folks are hard to comprehend." Ogleby dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "It's not like that, Mrs. Ives. Captain Tyler has been through a lot of experiences at sea that make him, well, perhaps a little different from us. And then his accident today would be upsetting to anybody. You do the best you can, and I'll come back in a day or so." Typically, Captain Tyler was his old self again within 24 hours, holding off any and all questions regarding the previous episode. Mrs. Ives reported to Dr. Ogleby, however, that the sailor spent much more time down at the seashore looking out at the ocean. "Kind of as though he's waiting for something," she said. "Or somebody." "He's a sailor," replied the medical man. "It follows that he's fond of water. Too bad they take a man like that off a boat and tie him up to the shore. Still, there's a nice pension," he added as an afterthought. The next few weeks of warm summer weather passed quickly, when one night at his office door, Ogleby was called upon by Captain Tyler himself. The old man was greatly perturbed. He had thinned a bit, and his face was drawn and shadowed. "Dr. Ogleby," he started hesitantly after the greetings, "I've got to get out of Clarksville right away. You're the only person I know here, excepting Mrs. Ives. I wondered if you could help me to get rid of my little berth." There was such pleading in the old man's eyes that the doctor at once offered to do all he could to help him dispose of the house. "What's brought you to this decision, though, Captain? I thought you liked our country." "Well, I do and I don't," said Tyler. "Anyway, I thought I'd go someplace else as quick as possible." Dr. Ogleby decided to speak what was in his mind. "Is it because of that fellow you think is after you?" Fear crowded across the old sailor's face. "Guess it is," he answered in a low voice, studying his hands. "Don't mind speaking up to you that I'm scared, Doc. I lie there at night listening to the sea, and I hear him outside splashing around waiting for me. And then I get so I think I see those eyes looking right through the wall at me. He thinks he's got me now. Maybe I did wrong that time years ago, but I can't stand having him haunting me this way." Ogleby put a sympathetic arm around his patient. "I'll do all I can to help you," said the doctor. "When do you think we could get this settled?" Tyler pushed. "Well, of course, it does take some time. If I could go away quick. A few days at the least it'll take." "Do the best you can, Doctor," said the old seafarer. The next day, Ogleby made several inquiries around town. It pleased him to find that it probably would be possible to take over Captain Tyler's little cottage within a reasonably short time. Full of this news, and at the end of his calls early, he decided to head his coupe out toward the skipper's home. Reaching there, he alighted and walked into the house. Mrs. Ives was baking biscuits in the kitchen, and didn't know where the captain was. "He's probably out taking one of his walks," she said. "Most likely you'll find him down near the water." Dr. Ogleby thanked her and headed outside. He picked his way carefully along a well-defined trail that ran through some pine trees toward the beach. Topping a small rise, he came to a place where the trees were not so numerous. He was able to look down on the water and the beach. Sure enough, there was Captain Tyler. But wait a minute, there was something wrong. Ogleby's thoughts ran back to the neighbor boy Harley's story of a few weeks ago. The physician's heart pounded, and he broke into a run, coming off the little promontory and starting through the rest of the wooded part for the beach. For Tyler had been in sight all right, but where he had no right to be, in water up to his waist and heading further out, struggling and splashing, as though against some unseen underwater force that was inexorably pulling him out. Just before Ogleby cleared the last of the trees to run onto the beach, a scream came back to him, and then it was strangely muffled as though from beneath the water. There was also the sound of mad thrashing and splashing, and then Ogleby was on the beach, rushing toward where he had last seen Captain Tyler. For the captain was no more. He had vanished completely. Ogleby stormed up and down the beach for several minutes. Then he rushed back, calling at the top of his lungs, "Mrs. Ives! Mrs. Ives!" After several tries, he got a response. "Come down here quickly, and bring anybody else you can get." Ogleby strode back to the water's edge and peered out over the now rippleless surface. The tide was coming in, but there was no indication of where Tyler had gone. Should he wade out a ways? This question was settled for Dr. Ogleby, when suddenly, about 200 yards off the beach, something black and log-like and motionless quietly broke the surface of the water. Ogleby fought the terror that choked his throat. It was a human body floating out there, face down. By now, Mrs. Ives came gasping up, and not far behind, the lanky form of Harley, with his father in tow, both panting. Ogleby motioned out to the water mutely. Mrs. Ives' near-sighted eyes nearly popped, trying to make out what it was. Harley said, "Geez," and Harley Sr. gasped. "Well, what's this all about?" said the housekeeper, irritably, but the tide was slowly nudging the black, rigid form closer. Mrs. Ives gaped then. A few more minutes, and the body bobbed and drifted its slow way up near the beach line. The men waded in and tugged at the weight. The body was got up on the dry sand. Dr. Ogleby felt for pulse, but this time there was not the faintest flicker of life. The face was frozen in a terrible mask of horror. The body was stiff and wooden-like. The arms held rigid, huge fists clenched tightly. "Give me a hand here," muttered Ogleby, and the man and boy helped him tote the big body up to the house in dreary procession. Ogleby hustled the others from the skipper's room, wanting to make a thorough examination in private. Straightened out on his own bed, Captain Tyler's figure was forlorn. There was no question about it. The man had died of drowning. Dr. Ogleby was interested in the rigidity of the body. He tried to bend Tyler's arms from the elbow. The man's features had been sealed as though by concrete and plaster, by a fear so great that it had changed his very appearance. It was then, and only then, that the physician noticed that there was something in the left clenched fist. For some minutes he worked over the dead sailor, working and forcing the strong fingers apart. Finally, he succeeded in opening them. In the palm of Captain Tyler's hand was a lump of wetness, almost like seaweed. Without looking closely, Ogleby absently dropped it into his own pocket. As he brushed against the body, a jingling noise attracted his attention. Stopping to examine it, methodically he went through the old sailor's pocket, finally finding a huge ring with many jingling keys upon it. A sudden thought occurred to the physician. He crossed to the forbidden closet that was never opened and tried one after another of the keys. At last, one fitted. He slipped back the bolt and pulled at the knob. The inside and contents of the closet were unspectacular. An old chest in the corner which, when the lid was lifted, revealed nothing but some worthless trinkets, probably of only sentimental value. A cutlass on the floor, some coloured blankets, picked up in some exotic port, and some old shipmaster's equipment. Ogleby was about to leave, when his eye was caught by something hanging in the corner. He moved closer. There was a skipper's uniform, perhaps of another decade, old but well kept and brushed, the buttons shiny. Then he leaned forward. There was a piece of cloth torn out of the front, and the third button with it. The master's jacket Tyler had worn on the Betsy May. His hands shaking, Ogleby leaned forward and looked at the rent closely for several moments. Ogleby quit the closet then, locking the door carefully behind him. He replaced the keys and covered Captain Tyler. Then he crossed to the window of the little bedroom. He looked out, and below he could see the water. The ways of the sea were strange, he thought, taking no account of time and distance, and even death. He felt into his pocket then, and brought forth what he knew he would find. The wet clump of something that was old cloth serge with a rusted button in the centre. Strangely preserved it was, and perfectly matching that rip in the old master's uniform hanging in the closet. Drowned Argosies by J. Wilmer Benjamin. The Vulcania had gone down. This much Charteris knew. It was all he felt he could possibly lay claim to knowing. Drifting 5 days in an open boat in the Caribbean Sea is not conducive to sanity. Not that Charteris was going mad. Far from it. But he couldn't understand the ghastly people who seemed to be trying to talk to him. They were sailormen, he knew it, but what a peculiar crew. There were half-naked galley slaves with the great calluses still on their palms. There were old shellbacks, barefoot and naked above the waist. There were men who had driven the great clipper ships from Canton to London in 60 days. And there were men like Charteris, who knew the intricacies of the great liner's guts. They were trying to talk to him. Then Charteris shook his head. Dead men can't talk. The sun beat down. The brazen sea reflected it. Water, water, water. That was Charteris's sole thought. Finally, one old shellback, whose gaunt figure betokened great strength and greater endurance, beckoned him, and Charteris heard, I say, matey, don't worry. Who do you want to sign on with? What do you mean? Asked Charteris. You can't. The old shellback laughed, and Charteris shuddered. It is odd to hear ghosts laugh, and Charteris knew these were ghosts. Where else could men have come from in all that dying sea? Think we're dead, don't you? Said the shellback. Well, we ain't. Only time a sailor dies is when they plant him 6 feet under in a churchyard. There's men here who served in every kind of craft, from a boy-ream to a liner. Who are you? Asked Charteris. Me? Why, bless you. I sailed with Paul Jones on the Ranger. A good captain, that. Only a bit of a driver. Paul Jones? Why, man, he's dead nearly 200 years. Not quite that, said the old shellback, and laughed. Ah, thought Charteris, I must be going mad. Not quite that, said the old shellback again. Now you take Petrus here. And he waved a hand toward a squat, hairy, half-naked man. He sailed with Quintus Maximus when they stripped the Mediterranean of the Carthaginian boats. Petrus grinned and gabbled something. The old shellback translated. He says it was a hell of a good fight, and you should have seen 'em scatter when the boy-reams came. What? Served under Quintus Maximus? Why, man, that's 1900 years ago. Nigh 2000, but what's time? What's time? And he spat. That, thought Charteris, was the ragged limit. He must be mad. There was silence once more, until Charteris leaned his head against a thwart and began to cry in long, racking sobs. The shellback reached over, and Charteris shivered at the touch of his hand. It was icy cold, in spite of the brazen sun still sending its red-hot rays to beat on Charteris's back. I felt that way when they left me to drift too. You know, I was the man they lost from the Ranger. But hell, here's Hendrik Hudson. Want to talk to him about drifting? No, said Charteris. No. A voice broke in, a deep voice, vibrant with sympathy. Poor youngster. They all feel that way just before they sign on. Myself, I felt it too. Who are you? Charteris asked wildly. Hendrik Hudson, captain of the Half Moon. What are you doing here? I signed on to sail under Admiral Beresford. I command the Saturnia. Do you want to sign on with me? What do you mean? Young fool, do you not know that we who sailed the 7 seas still sail beneath her bosom? Look! And he stabbed a thick fat finger at the green waves. Weakly, Charteris crawled to the gunwale and looked. Down below he saw a tall clipper ship sailing serenely. Her sails were gone, and in their places were long streamers of kelp. From truck to keelson she was wreathed with flying seaweed, but about her decks moved sailormen going to and fro, quite as if it were their normal life. Muffled by 60 fathoms of water, he heard the strokes of a ship's bell, and a dim voice. 3 bells! Relieve the wheel and look out! But I know nothing about sailing ships, Captain. I'm an engineer. So? Nat. and Hendrik Hudson turned to the old shellback. "Does Captain Lux need an engineer?" "Depends, Captain. I hear he needed a man with an extra first certificate. Call him up, will you?" And Charteris's eyes bulged as he saw the sailor, Nat, produce a boatswain's whistle and blow an odd piping call. The sea boiled, and up rose a man dressed even as Charteris's old captain. The 4 gold stripes of a master mariner shone as they had in the days when Captain Lux had proudly trod the deck of the Titania. "Hello, what's up?" he boomed, and Charteris noticed that there was a slight hiss to the S's, as though the captain had false teeth. "This man, Captain," said Nat, respectfully pulling his forelock, "is gonna sign on with you." What can he do?" "I'm an extra first, sir," said Charteris, convinced by now that all this was more than just a dream, that it was indeed actually life. Dimly on the horizon rose a faint smudge of smoke as a long, lean Coast Guard cutter drove its knife-like prow through the waters, searching for survivors of the Vulcania. On the bridge, a tense officer quartered the sea with terrible efficiency. "God," he thought, "to be left adrift here. Bosun." His voice was sharp. He had picked up the white speck that was Charteris's boat. "A quarter west. Call the captain. I see a boat." "Aye, aye, sir." The wheel spun. A messenger raced aft to get the captain. The captain took his position on the bridge and whistled down the speaking tube. "Engine room," he said. "Bridge speaking. Can you get a couple more knots out of this hooker?" The funnels belched black smoke. The destroyer's frame quivered as her mighty engines thrust her forward with renewed speed. She stood by Charteris's floating prison. A boat was lowered, and able seamen lifted Charteris, trying weakly to salute someone they could not see, to its security. "I'll be honored to sign on, sir," mumbled Charteris vaguely. They had seen men adrift in open boats before. They knew what the sea and sun can do. So they looked at him sympathetically, and went about the business of transferring him to the cutter. Tenderly, the hard seamen carried him below, still talking of things they did not understand, of drowned ships, and that ghastly whistle on the Saturnia. Charteris gazed wildly about him. He seemed to be trying to place his surroundings. "My new quarters, Captain?" he asked hoarsely. "Take it easy, son. You're all ship-shape now," advised a grizzled boatswain's mate. Charteris looked at the speaker without comprehension. Suddenly he fell back, and began to babble unintelligibly. The old boatswain's mate pursed his lips and spat thoughtfully. Then he bent forward. His eyes widened. Swiftly he straightened, and crossed himself reverently. "Cripes," said he in amazement. "How'd this guy know Lux, and know he had false teeth?" Death of the Kraken by David H. Keller. "Brother, can you spare a dime?" the man asked me in the low monotone used by the chronic panhandler. "No money," I replied, "but I will give you a good meal and something to drink." I took him to a chop house. From the way he ate there was no doubt of his hunger. It seemed that he never would be satisfied. Finally he finished, emptied his glass of beer, and accepted a cigarette. He looked across the table at me. "That is the first meal I have had for 2 days, he said. "And what do you do for a living that makes you want to feed a man like me?" "I write for a living," I answered, with a little twisted smile. "And sometimes I sell what I write, and sometimes I fail to. When my brain gets dull, I hunt up a man like you, and he tells me a story." "So you want a story to pay for the meal?" "If you have one and want to tell it to me. But you do not really owe me anything. I was amply repaid by your enjoyment of the food. Ever hear of the Sargasso Sea?" "Sure. For some thousands of years, every traveler has told about it. Maundeville described it. Columbus sailed through it. Oviedo gave it a name from sargasso, the Portuguese word for seaweed. Drake sailed through it for 5 days. The scientist Humboldt described it. What do you know about it? Not much, but I have been there. No story in that. Thousands have been there. Used to be a place of mystery, port of lost ships caught in the weeds and rotting till they sunk. But those old stories were based on fancy. Simply a lot of weeds there, mainly the Sargassum bacciferum, and ocean trash carried by the Gulf Stream. The old tales of prisoned ships and sea monsters were just the imagination of frightened seamen whose memory became more vivid with every drink of rum. Then no matter what I tell you, you will not believe me? What difference does that make so long as I listen? Have a drink? Yes, another beer. Now, in regard to the story. I was loafing one day in the lobby of a cheap hotel here in New York, wondering how much longer I could go without food, when up comes a man and asks if I want a job. We started to talk, and it seemed that he wanted a man who could handle a machine gun, or even something bigger. That was right in my line. Yes, sir. When it comes to machine guns, I know what I'm doing. I have used them in a dozen wars, from a half-pint revolution in South America to real fighting in the World War. Of course, I did not know where he was going to take me in the gun, but a job just then looked rather good to me. It turned out that it was not a real fight he was financing, but a sea voyage. He was interested in this Sargasso Sea, had an idea that everything the old travellers wrote about it was not so much imagination, told me that there must be some part of their story true, and he was going to find out. Had his ship and crew and only lacked a gunner. What do you want a machine gun for? I asked him. He tried to explain it to me. He said he had been working on the trip for years, and had read everything he could put his hands on. All the tales of the old travellers, starting in with a Greek called Plato. I happen to remember that name because he called the old cat on the ship Plato. Then he went on to say that one part of the story, which was repeated again and again, had to do with sea monsters that picked the sailors off the ships and ate them, and if anything like that happened to us, a machine gun would come in handy. I signed for the trip. Of course, I did not believe his story about those sea monsters, thought he was starting a little private war or something, but the wages were good, and when I saw a ship, I knew the eating was going to be good. That man Ferguson was certainly a real man, and he tried his best to make the crew have a comfortable time. His ship had made several voyages north, and it sure was stoutly built. Sails when there was a wind, and an oil-burning engine to use in the calm. There were 8 of us aboard, the captain, 4 sailors, the cook, Ferguson, and myself. Second day out of New York, he explained his plan to us. Once in the Gulf Stream, he was going to drift. If his idea was right, the ship would finally find its way right into the middle of this Sargasso Sea, and he claimed that there was no telling what we would find there, because for some hundreds of years all the ships had tried their best to keep away from this center, instead of hunting for it. "Have another glass of beer," I suggested. "You are telling a good story, and another drink will help you make it better." "No, I will wait till I finish." We sailed on for about a week, and finally get to the place where the captain thinks we can start drifting, and that is what we do. On the 3rd day, we see some weeds, and in a week the whole ocean is covered with them. From then on, the ship went slower and slower. Some days, for several hours at a time, it hardly seemed to move at all. Ferguson was having the time of his life studying the weeds and the little fish that lived among them. He would talk to us every night about the new discoveries of the day. One night, he showed us a fish that had legs on it instead of fins, and toes on the end of the legs. Every time he found a new fish, he would put it in a glass jar with alcohol to pickle it. Happy as a boy with a new toy. Of course, the life was slow for the rest of us, but he was the boss, and our pay was good, and we sort of jollied him along. "And how soon did you meet the first wreck?" I asked. He laughed. "We actually did see them. 5 in one day when we came into the dead center of the sea. By that time the weeds made a mat that in some places was over 5 feet deep. It almost looked as though a man could walk on it, and here and there a ship silently rotting, and almost covered with barnacles and weeds. In 3 days we visited 7 of them, and the night of the 3rd day Ferguson asked me to have a talk with him in his cabin. He asked me if I had noticed anything peculiar about those 7 ships. Of course, I told him that they were all old, but what he wanted me to say was that there were no bones on any of them. I laughed at him when he said that. Bones? Of course not. Those old ships got stuck in the weeds, and when the crews found out that they were not going to get out of the weeds any other way, they provisioned boats and tried to get out to open water. Ferguson did not see it that way. You see, he still had the idea that some kind of animal had eaten those sailors before they had time to either escape or starve to death. Then he asked me to have the gun ready, because there was just a chance that this animal would come after us. Of course, he was the boss, and I was there to obey him. So I humored him and asked him just what kind of an animal he thought was going to eat us, because I wanted to know how to mount the gun and where to shoot at it. "Wait a minute," I said, interrupting him. "Let me tell you what Ferguson told you. I have read a great many of those old tales. Ferguson had nothing else to go by except those stories. He put them all together, and from them made a composite animal. It had a body about 30 feet long, 4 legs, and a tail. The neck was as long as the body, ending in a head big as a barrel with large eyes as big as dinner plates. There are whiskers about 3 feet long. It could swallow a man with 1 gulp. How's that? Anything like what Ferguson told you?" "Just about right. Of course, I thought he was daffy to even think there could be such a creature. But if he was willing to pretend there was one, I was willing to string along with him. We talked it over, and decided that the only way to kill anything like that was to put 12 bullets into the brain, through the eyes, or the open mouth. And that would take some clever shooting, because that critter was not going to hold its head still when he was charging on the ship. The next morning I got the gun out and put it together and fired a few practice shots. That was sure a sweet gun, and worked as easy as a sewing machine. If you moved it slowly, you could cut a tree down with the bullets. Some of the crew asked me what it was for, but I didn't tell them about the idea Ferguson had. What was the use? I knew there wasn't any such animal. That next night, the night after I put the gun on deck, 2 of the crew who had been on deck duty disappeared. Just dropped out of the picture. Not a drop of blood, not a sound of pain or fear. On the deck at early dawn, off the deck at sunrise, nothing to explain it. Ferguson listened to the captain's report and made no comments. He simply went ahead with his study of the little fishes. The captain rested all that day, and the next night he stayed on the deck till morning, while the 2 sailors took alternate watches. Nothing happened, and nothing unusually different for another night. Then on the 3rd night, morning came, and the captain and one of the sailors were gone. Sounds rather silly to put it that way, to simply say they were gone. That left 4 of us, the cook, 1 sailor, Ferguson, and myself. I talked it over with the sailor, and then I went and told the boss that the best thing to do would be to get the engine started if we could, and get out of there while the getting was good. But he said no. If those men had been eaten by that animal, sea monster or kraken or whatever I wanted to call it, it was up to me to kill it, and that was why he had brought me along with the crew. I told him I would take a chance at killing anything in the daytime, but what chance was there hitting it at night, when it attacked us so silently that there was no alarm given by the 1 sailor who had escaped? "Your story is getting good," I commented. "You bet it is. And now listen to this." The cook was a rather old man, and he was just plain jittery, drunk much of the time, and trembled like a leaf when he had to go on deck, even in the daytime. The next night, the 3 of us were in the cabin waiting for supper. Of course, we were not supposed to eat together. Not the best of discipline on a ship to have the crew eat with the master. But Ferguson thought it would make things easier for the cook. So we were waiting and wondering why the cook was late bringing the food. Ferguson said he was going to see what was the matter, and he left the cabin. And when he came back, he simply said that the cook was gone. The 3 of us hunted all over the ship, but we never found him. There was a tray of spilled food on the deck. He must have been carrying it to us when he was caught. At least that was the way Ferguson figured it out. "That is the only plausible explanation," I said. "Sure it is. Now, that left 3 of us. I made up my mind to trick that monster. Told Ferguson about my plan, and he thought it pretty good. We made a dummy out of some old sails and smeared it all over with lard to make it smell, and then we put that dummy up near the mast with a lantern near him, and I trained the gun so it would spray the bullets about 4 feet over his head, and I was going to stay there, and when the monster dove for him I would start shooting. Ferguson and the sailor were going to stay on deck, but at the other end of the ship. Nothing happened. Not a thing. Toward morning the boss came up and said he was going down and get some sleep. At sunup I decided to get something to eat and try to sleep. Not that I felt sleepy, you understand, because my nerves were jumpy, but it seemed that if I had to go through another night of watching, I just had to sleep. And when I was drinking my coffee, it just occurred to me that I had not seen the sailor. I hunted for him, could not find him, and then woke Ferguson. All he knew was that the sailor had been on deck when he had gone to his cabin. We talked it over, and decided that while I was watching that dummy, the damn thing had sneaked around the other side and caught the last sailor and killed him before he had time to yell even once. I told Ferguson that as far as I was concerned, I had had just enough. The best thing we could do was to get that engine started if we could and get away from there before we died like the other 6. He asked me to stay just one more night and try the dummy bait again. If nothing happened then, he promised to leave the next morning. I did not like the idea and told him so, but finally I gave in to him. We worked on the engine that day and found it was in perfect condition. He knew a good deal about machinery and showed me just how to start it and run it in case, he said, anything happened to him the next night. But he promised to stay shut in his cabin and not come out till he heard me start the machine gun. How about that beer? I ordered it for him, and he drank it slowly. Then he continued his story. I was rather sure by this time that the whole thing was a clever lie, but I wanted to know how he was going to finish it. Toward dusk I put some bacon on the dummy to make him smell better, and then I started to do some tall thinking. There was no moon and not much starlight. That animal, Kraken or whatever you want to call it, was smart. What he would likely do was to recognize the fact that the dummy was just so much bait, and he would sneak up in back of me and take me instead of the bait. The thing to do was to turn the machine gun around the other way. Then, when he came for me, I would start firing. I would be standing looking at the bait, but at the least noise I would swing around and get the gun working. And there in the darkness I waited, and waited, glad that Ferguson was safe in his cabin. And then, just when I felt I simply could not wait any longer, I heard a little swishing sound in back of me. I jumped around and started that damned gun squirting. And then what happened? I asked. I stopped the gun and waited. Not a sound. Everything was as black as it could be, except for the lantern up by the dummy. I did not have the least idea whether I had hit that monster or only frightened it. I guess I didn't care very much. Here is the peculiar part. I've been through all kinds of hell in my life, and it never fazed me. But this time I was sick, and I wanted to see Ferguson. It was not the boss especially, just anyone I could talk to. I felt my way down to his cabin. He had a light burning, but he wasn't there. Gone. And I was feeling so low that I just locked the door and threw myself down on his bunk. Man, but I felt sick. I suppose Ferguson decided to go up on deck during the night and the beast grabbed him? I asked. That was the way I figured it out. Anyway, I stayed there till morning, and then I went on deck. Thought I would have a look around and see if I'd hit that sea thing and then start the engine and get out if I could. All I could think of was to get away as soon as I could. Can I have another beer? You certainly can. Now, when you went on deck with the sun shining, what did you find? He drank the beer slowly, and then even more slowly said in a whisper, I found Ferguson, just about cut in two by the bullets. You killed him instead of the monster? Just that. got jitters and fired at the first noise in back of me, and I guess he never knew what hit him. It was a mess. And now to the end of this story. I managed to start the engine and raise a few sails, though it took me a long time. But I got out of there and sailed east, and when I got in sight of the Azores, I set the ship afire and went ashore in a boat. Of course, there was an investigation, but I just answered questions and did not tell the whole story. So finally I was allowed to leave and took the first tramp steamer back to America. And so you never saw the Kraken? No, and I do not think there ever was one. What makes you say that? I asked sharply. You say those men disappeared. If it wasn't a sea monster, what was it? Ferguson. I know you are lying now. Knew you would think so. Never told the story to anyone before, because I knew no one would believe me. But Ferguson was a real scientist. He wanted to devote his life to a study of those little animals in the floating seaweed. He knew that no one would willingly stay there month after month with him, but he had to have a crew to get him there. He took me and the gun along to cover up his crime. How do you know that? You are practically saying that he killed the men. Am I? Well, I have reason to think so. Why? Because he kept a daily record of everything he did, and I found that book in his cabin. He would sneak up behind those men, crush their skulls with a blackjack, tie some lead to their feet, and throw them overboard. He did that to the cook when he went out to see why he was late with the meal, and he was going to do it to me, only I outsmarted him. The man must have been insane. Sure of all this? Better than sure. He had the blackjack in his hand and his hand up ready to strike when the bullets hit him. Now, do I get a night's lodging on that story?